But let me start by just saying that my last day as a civilian before getting drafted into Gordon Brown's government was spent at a slightly gloomy meeting of human rights organizations where Human Rights Watch was there, or not the ebullient Ken Roth, but a gloomier colleague. And it was chaired by Arye Nair, who many of you know, the president of the Open Society Institute. And it was all of us who've sort of been foot soldiers in this pushing of the international human rights agenda, preoccupied with the kind of brick wall we in some ways felt we were hitting up against. And the reasons for that have been very well stated already just in the last three interventions that I heard. The rise of governments who are resisting the globalization of human rights norms in a way that one had not expected to be the case 10 years ago. Frankly, as someone who spent many years pushing democracy in regions like the Middle East, I have to say if you like, abduction of that agenda at times in ways which just really defeated the cause of an internally generated democracy and human rights movement in the Middle East. I mean, all the brave people who helped me write the UNDP Arab Human Development Reports, suddenly felt themselves to have been out on a limb which had been cut off behind them when suddenly the arguments of those reports were employed for the interventions in Iraq. I think, but I think behind both all of this, in a sense, lies a crossroads moment in the development of international affairs, which we've all been slow to seize because none of us really want to accept that it's happened. If you see the period since 1989 as, a sort of glorious apparent rise in a global system which saw not just the globalization of markets, but the globalization of international legal norms, the globalization of democracy, the globalization perhaps even of many aspects of culture and consumption. We all, in a sense, let our guard down and bought into, in some ways, at least a diluted version of the Fukuyama thesis that history was over and that we were all converging as some great sort of happy, global, contented middle class. And, I think the realization that that's not the way the world's going and that one's seen precisely in part as a backlash against some of that, the reassertion of nationalism, of non-democratic political systems, even if many of them, adopt the outward pretense of democracy. The world is just getting a lot more tougher, conflictive. Debates about political systems and even ideological debates have reignited in ways that we had not foreseen. A lot of that's healthy. I don't think that there was any reason why, the world becoming one big bourgeois happy place isn't an idea worth challenging, because it probably, had in it, all sorts of loss of cultural identities and other important things. But obviously, many forms that this resistance has taken are, ugly and extremely dangerous and have led to not just a political backlash in somewhere like the United Nations, but also to terrorist movements and other much nastier manifestations of this resistance to change, if you like. So, we are in a much more difficult world, and I think the events of the last week or so in the financial markets are just one more manifestation and expression of that we've arrived at a point where, the world doesn't behave in predictable ways and respond to Western leadership as many had hoped would be the case. Now, what do we do about it? And here, I think it is a matter of, trying to broaden the ownership of these doctrines of human rights and democracy, but also of international governance that those of us in the West hold dear. It's not to give up, but it's to recognize that we need to get more people on our side, more people committed to these ideas. And if I can start with the international governance bit, we in the UK have been pressing very, very hard under the leadership of our Prime Minister for international institution reform, including reform of the UN Security Council and its membership, precisely to create a broader sense of ownership in these institutional arrangements, in the belief that with ownership will come responsibility, that countries allowed into the Security Council on a longer-term basis will start to behave with a better sense of their responsibility for global peace and security. I think on human rights, it requires broadly, similarly, getting a broader sense of participation. And here I think, I think as certainly as we critiqued ourselves in the human rights community in that meeting I mentioned of probably 15 or 16 months ago now, there was, a little bit of a sense that we had, perhaps led to an imbalance where we were so focused on political and civil rights that we were not paying enough attention to social and economic rights, and that for many poor people around the world, this had left the human rights agenda a little cold in their eyes, that they didn't see the immediate benefits to it. And I think similarly for democracy, there's got to be a much stronger case, not just on the highfalutin and to all of us enormously important issue of the individual's right to choose their own political leadership, but a focus too on the economic and social gains it brings, a focus on the fact that poor people can hold their governments to account, that it's a way of making sure that development is distributed more fairly to reach the poor as well as the rich. And so I think we've got to go back to these arguments we care about and refashion them for a more complicated, critical world where it's not enough to rely on our own aspirational and value-based arguments. We have to find ways of making these things matter to other people as well.